So without further ado, our keynote speaker, Phil Sotok. Phil comes to us from Holland, Michigan, in the Grand Rapids area. He grew up in a culture not unfamiliar to many of us. He grew up in a Catholic home, but in a very Protestant community with the Reformed Dutch tradition in Holland, Michigan. He got his BA in economics and mathematics from Hope College in 1992 and his MBA from the Thunderbird School of Global Management in 1996. In 2003, he founded VentureSource, a global distribution business for engineered products for vehicle interiors. So like ball bearings on your armrest and your mirrors in your Mercedes and those types of products are what Phil's business produces and provides as resources to the automotive industry. In 2017, he took a passion of his to engage his faith in Catholic social teaching and consider how can this impact business. And he founded and began work with DPMC North America, and their mission is to help discover fundamental values of your company and launch rapid cultural change with a system that focuses on the human dimension of management. Most importantly, he's a husband to his wife Jody for 18 years, father to 3 children, and member of St. Francis de Sales in Holland, Michigan. His favorite saint is St. Ignatius, and without further ado, join me in welcoming Phil Sotok.
Lift this up a little bit here. Thank you, Joe, for that wonderful introduction. So I've been here twice now in my life to Sioux Falls, both this year, and there's something that I felt I ought to share because it struck me the first time I was here. I kind of felt it. There is a sense of community here that one notices when they first come for the first time. And it was interesting to me because it was a sense of community that was all moving in the same direction. And that was notable. And I come, like Joe said, from West Michigan, and it's a faith-based region. We have a lot of faith-based businesses and business leaders, but at times we're all moving in different directions. And so I felt that was something that I should share with you just because it was inspiring to me. So here I am, supposed to be giving something to you and sharing something to you, and I come here and thank you. I come here and you're sharing with me, so thank you for that. Now Joe keeps mistaking me for a fancy speaker, which I am not, and you'll soon see that. I am a business practitioner, just like many of you here, but I do hope to share with you something. This is a passion of mine that I have, and it's a passion of mine because I believe purpose and meaning at work is something that can revolutionize how we do work together with each other, and so that's become very important to me. And so hopefully I can share something with you that's meaningful today, that's inspiring, and maybe something you can take with you. But to do that first, instead of talking in platitudes, which I can do, or many could do on a topic like purpose, let me just set the context. Let me set the framework here with a story. And it's a story about, you could say it's a story about searching. It's a story about Sarah, and Sarah is a friend of mine. Sarah and I grew up together, and we went to school together. But Sarah went to one of these prestigious graduate schools, and she took her first job with a Fortune 100 company. It was something that she had a goal of doing. She wanted to get into this company for a number of years, and so she was very happy that she was able to get into this company, and they were very happy to have her. And they put her on one of these like global rotation programs, right, where they move people all over the world. So she had all these awesome experiences, was gaining all this knowledge about the business and about world. And so you would think that all that this organization was pouring into her, that this was a perfect setup for Sarah, that this was kind of like her plan coming to fruition. But about 5 years into this job, Sarah left, despite everything that they were putting into her, and this was all positive things. She left the company. So why would she leave a company that just a few years earlier was her dream job, in her own words, something that she put forth quite a bit of effort to get, to attain? What was missing? What was lacking in this setup? So I asked Sarah that question, and she said something interesting. She said a few years in, it dawned upon her that the management and leadership in this organization was not looking at her for who she was or who she might become, but they were looking at her more like from a perspective of where she might fit within their predefined organizational structure, what track she should go on, and so forth, which is not all bad. But for Sarah, it left her feeling like she said she was playing like this zero-sum game, where her gain invariably was somebody else's loss in this picture, and that left her with a deep disconnect. She said, I couldn't find meaning in what I was being asked to do, and maybe more importantly, why I was being asked to do it. So it's kind of like the proverbial cog in the wheel, maybe. So this is a theme I want to dance around this morning, and I want to pack that a little further with you and give you some perspectives on how we might go about solving our own Sarah challenge, whether that's us, ourselves, or somebody that we work with. Now, it's not a discussion on how to connect with millennials or how to connect with Gen Z, the generation per se, but it is a discussion about how to connect, okay? And my hope is that you leave today with a general understanding that fulfillment and meaning in work is as much about us and our own mindset about it as it is with the environment, the prompts, and the triggers that we have around us every day. So first, though, let me talk a little bit about purpose in general at a high level, maybe macro perspective, because there's a lot being said on this topic in the last few years, a lot of hubbub on purpose. And so I'll give you this example a few years ago, and this isn't where it necessarily started, but it kind of frames it up. Michael Porter from Harvard made a bold statement. He said that this idea of shared value, he wrote an article about shared value, which from his perspective is that the aim of any organization should not only be profitability, but also purpose, higher societal purpose. And when you put those two things together, that can reinvent capitalism. Now that's a pretty big idea, and purpose is wrapped up right there in there. And we hear a lot about purpose. You can't pick up a business magazine today without reading something about the power of purpose in organizations, how that can transform the workforce. It can improve employee engagement or lower turnover or speak to millennials or simply just enhance organizational performance. But the interesting thing about purpose, at least for me, is many are still looking at it like it's an ideal, something that we construct or create in order to inspire people. And I think that's why so many organizations today, they have a purpose, right? They have a true north, but they're struggling to enculturate that within their people. They're struggling to sustain that idea and that inspiration around their purpose. So I think really we're talking much more about a how-to question today. It's not whether or not purpose is important. I think we all get that. It's how are we activating it within ourselves, within our teams, and within our organizations. So I like to say we're in the middle of a paradigm shift then as it relates to management, leadership, and organizational design. And this is evident in many thought leaders from Jim Collins to Daniel Pink and you fill in the blank, many others who are calling us to humanize the workplace. And their promise, if we do so, is this upper right-hand quadrant. Call it the purpose clarity quadrant. That's where long-term positive culture is defined by very high levels of collective purpose. And a very notable way to get there and maintain your place in that upper right-hand quadrant is to become purpose-driven. But that's not to be confused with merely having a statement of purpose. Because organizations that are truly purpose-driven measure success a little bit differently. They measure success from the perspective of the person's fulfillment and not merely their objective output. So they talk in terms of contribution, they talk in terms of unity, and they also structure and manage and run their businesses in the same fashion. So this is the big paradigm shift I think we'll see unfold in the coming years, and I think we must see it unfold, or we're going to have too many organizations remaining in these other three quadrants, and call those the slow death quadrants. And you'll have people coming into the workforce and into your organization essentially looking at the organization as something that's not necessarily going to be sustainable. Okay, so I will not talk about Simon Sinek, I promise that, but I will use his golden circle. And let's just call purpose now a new management logic. And this idea of running the business from a perspective, not so much from the perspective of what and how, but from the perspective of why. That now becomes the ultimate end game. And it will require that we look at everything in the business through this lens of purpose, whether that's our stakeholders, our strategies, how we design the organization, our procedures, our systems, and most certainly the people within. And that's an important point that I think we'll see many existing purpose-driven organizations that are out there today pushing this envelope further. That is, to look at the person through the lens of purpose is not merely to look at their skills and competencies, but it's to look at their reason for being. That now becomes the new point of departure. So imagine the resume of the future from that perspective will be quite interesting. And so practically speaking, I think we'll see an evolution, not a discard. We're not getting rid of these ideas, but we'll see an evolution from the practice of managing primarily by task and objective toward like an activation of missions around a collective purpose. And its missions are plural because we're dealing with individuals and each of us have different sources of meaning in our lives. So how are we really supposed to think about these ideas organizationally? Well, I think we can start by thinking about it as a form of co-creation and a way of unifying people, giving them identity around a higher cause. And we can ask ourselves three simple questions, or put it in the context of three simple whys. Ask yourself, why is anything that we do in the business, why does it matter? Why does it matter to the business itself? Why does it matter to the teams, the people within? And why does it matter to me? Because if we don't think about it this way, if we don't ask that question, then purpose remains this abstract idea, or the proverbial, plaque on the wall. And so let's just say, you're part of an organization that has a compelling purpose, and it inspires you. It doesn't necessarily mean, or it inspires the people within, doesn't necessarily mean that you'll wake up every morning knowing how your slice of work, per se, contributes to that end. And that's the connection that we need to make. That connection is critical, or purpose falls flat. And so again, I'll emphasize, it's not so much whether we have purpose. It's not even about how well we communicate our purpose to our employees and to the marketplace. It's that connection. And how well are we making that connection within our teams every day toward that purpose? That's how we start to move down the path of fulfillment. So for this, we need to be very diligent about bringing this idea of purpose and mission, not just to the top of the pyramid, not just to the leadership team, but to every individual in the organization. And we build it out from there very intentionally, connecting each person, each individual's purpose to the purpose of the organization. And that's the big idea, I think, because in business we can do exactly that. If we can create high purpose environments where people might respond freely to their calling, give of themselves with others in the workplace, and ultimately establish a higher level of community around them and with those that they work with. Now, as Christians, we understand that we're called to a higher purpose. And so if we are called to, as John Paul called us, to create a community of persons, if we are called to unify the body of Christ, then that must be understood to come from within each of us. Kind of as Father said today, it's here and now. It comes from within each of us. And so from that perspective, the purpose of any organization is really the expression of each individual's purpose within that organization, right? And that's what we want to align. That's our end game. And in that sense, the person becomes our end game. So I read a while back something that when I read it, it didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I read that the secret to great culture is that it embodies compassion. I didn't understand what that meant. I understand it now to mean the practice of seeing others as they are, of meeting them where they are, and of having humility enough maybe to know how we might or might not best serve them. And I think, in part, that is right because compassion can be a form of true, authentic, or genuine love in the workplace. And I came upon this radical idea early on in my career when I read an interview with Francois Michelin. Francois Michelin was the then CEO of Michelin Tires. And he said something in this interview and it stopped me in my tracks mentally. I didn't know what to do with it. And it was a simple question. He was asked what his overarching business philosophy was. He said, well, it comes from my grandfather, Edward, the founder of Michelin Tires, who told me, your number one priority as a leader is to love the employees for whom you are responsible, to love. And not a sentimental love, but quite simply, you have to see people as they are. So I absolutely believe he's talking about seeing each person's reason for being, building that out, helping them find that, and taking advantage of that. So maybe this is, that first graph that we looked at. Maybe this is another way of looking at it, but from Michelin's perspective. As we move into the upper right-hand quadrant, where we know long-term positive culture exists, we're not only moving into an area of highly unified teams, but we're also moving into a way of being that might be, captured by the word compassion. And I guess that's the whole point. When organizations are centering around a meaningful purpose, they're also establishing the right environments, ones with very high levels of interpersonal relationships that could be characterized by words like compassion and further defined by words that we're hearing a lot of today: trust, emotional safety, vulnerability, empathy, certainly low levels of self-interest. And so from this perspective, we're building on environments where people can more easily find meaning together. Okay? They can come together to find meaning because we know when people can relate to one another, they can also develop a collective sense of purpose together. So this is unity. It's the co-creation between the organization and the individual. It's not necessarily born from alignment. It comes from a deeper cut. Okay? I think of alignment as an outward-in phenomenon, and unity is an inward-out phenomenon. Right? Okay, so let's start to move into some practical ideas here and ask the million-dollar question. How on earth do we create this thing called unity when we can barely create enough alignment in our organizations as it is? Unity above all requires an approach to the business that's much more holistic in its perspective and much less fragmented or piecemealed. And let me describe that here a bit. We need to address three key dimensions in the organization with respect to purpose: our strategy or our strategic intent, the design that we have in the organization, our systems, our procedures, practices, and then our leadership activity, our leadership behaviors. And we specifically need to ensure the business has structured three things: coherence, authenticity, and integrity. And let me just explain that, because coherence, for example, is strategy is what we're going to do. What we say we're going to do has to be very consistent with how we do it. And likewise, what we say we're going to do has to be very consistent with why we do it. And why we do it has to be consistent with how we do it. It's a classic says easy, does hard concept. And I'll give you an example to kind of explain that. Let's just say you're part of an organization that has a guiding principle of doing what's right by the customer. And so you would think that in this company, you might want to ensure that such a principle is not only expressed externally, but also expressed or understood in earnest internally. And you might also think that if this company is operating with a compensation structure that puts one salesperson against the other salesperson in kind of a zero-sum play, that would be conceived or perceived as rather incoherent internally within the team. And that's because when we ask our teams to work within a system that conditions contradictory outcomes relative to what we're asking our the people to do or the corporate directives, then the result is confusion, the result is cynicism, and in some cases the result is a big fat PR mess, like we've seen with Uber, like we've seen with Wells, like we've seen with Google, like we've seen with Facebook, and you can go on and on and on. So the point is there's very capable, very large, capable organizations out there that are getting this simple concept wrong. That's why I say it's a says easy, does hard concept. And so it just serves as an example to express the importance of looking at the organization more holistically and connecting these three dimensions, but it's also an accountability framework. It's absolutely also an accountability framework, as much as it is a recipe for sustaining the right perspectives around our context or context around our purpose, rather. Okay, so let's peel that onion back one layer further. In the sake of time, I'll give you one living example around this idea of the triangle, or putting the triangle in practice. Now, the example is an organization, maybe you know them. It's clearly in the upper right-hand quadrant. They have high levels of unity in their organization, high sense of purpose, solid interpersonal relationships. The organization is Barry Waymiller. They're out of St. Louis. They're a $2.5 billion global conglomerate of industrialized packaging goods. And in 1987, this man, Bob Chapman here, set out with his leadership team on a very aggressive strategy. It was a growth through acquisition strategy. And that was based on, kind of predicated on one of the comparative advantages that they wanted to exploit in the marketplace. That was clearly their what. Clearly their what. But in their case, this was only a sound strategy as long as it was connected to their how and to their why. Let me explain that. I had the opportunity to have dinner with Bob Chapman, and he told us this story. He said, when we set out on this strategy, we made two commitments to the organization, within the leadership team and to the organization as a whole. The first commitment was 0 layoffs. They committed that this acquisition strategy would not be a ploy for labor rationalization, but rather it was a strategy specifically designed to enhance opportunities for the workforce. In fact, they saw that as the way of growing their workforce. So this was their why. In his own words, he said, we wanted to build a great business so that we could build great people. Okay, so you can see how that was very well connected, the what and the why. Now, the second commitment they made was they committed to balance the velocity of this growth with an idea that they called internally radical patience for their people. And why is this interesting? Well, because from 1987 until just last year, Barry Waymiller acquired over 100 companies. That's over 3 companies a year consecutively for 30 years. So you can imagine they had ample opportunity to rationalize, to downsize, to get rid of dead weight, to optimize. But they made a commitment to balance this velocity of growth with this idea of radical patience. So they committed to not outgrow their people. In other words, to not use them as stepping stones. This was their how. They intentionally structured the organization and its systems to allow people the space they needed to find their place. And in Bob's own words, as it relates to this idea of radical patience, he said, if we stand by people long enough and we show them who they are and how they can contribute, they will find themselves. This was so important that they made it part of their acquisition process. It became embedded in the process. Now, the acquisition process was their lifeblood, right? This was their growth engine. And this idea of radical patience was part of that. So you can see how their what and their how are very well connected. So this is an example. It brings the 3 key dimensions together in the organization, shows how we can be very intentional about connecting those dots and looking at that through the lens of purpose. Now, just imagine the trust that developed. The CEO stands in front of his organization 30 years ago and says, here's the commitments we're going to make to you, and day in and day out, they walk that talk. Imagine the stories that started to form around that, right? So that's the bottom line. That's the integrity component. Okay, so let's look at the all-important connection, but at the personal level, because we know now there's two things critical to forming purpose and meaning at work. One is this idea of purpose clarity that we've been talking about. The other is we have to make a connection at the personal level. And I'll use my organization as an example here. We're trying, at least for the last couple of years, we've been trying to be intentional about connecting our people's passion and purpose with the work that we're asking them to do. We call this legacy work. And it's really, its aim is to help each employee create an image of success of themselves in the future in work and in life. So we call it legacy work because the first thing we ask them to do is write a couple paragraphs on their legacy, which is a common practice nowadays. There's a variety of tools that we help the person in walking down this path, but there's really two paths that we try to walk each employee down. And it's two paths of virtue. And the first path is we want to help them walk down the path of magnanimity. What I mean by that is we want to help people see the greatness that resides within them and understand that, understand their unique contribution and how that might be presented back to the world, so to speak. And the second is a walk down the path of humility. Now, those two things have to go together. This idea of seeking greatness in oneself and others and this deep sense of humility have to go together. Here we want to help people know themselves better, but in relation to those around them, in relation to their external circumstances, so that they can understand how better to serve the other. So the outcome of this work, and takes us about a year to walk people through this in some cases. The outcome of this work is the articulation of the individual's purpose, their why, but also its contribution, its expression back to the whole, back to the organization, or back to their spheres of influence in life, as we say, and one of those spheres being work. And there's typically an aha moment that happens, that we've seen happen in this process. As the person starts to recognize that this activity is not about the job, right? It's really about them. The point of departure is them, and they start to recognize that, that it's me. I'm the one that brings meaning to whatever I do. And it's not something that someone can dictate upon us. It's not even something that's out there around the corner for us to discover necessarily. It's already in us. It's kind of like what Father said today. It's like the here and now. It's in us, and we need to bring that out. And we need to help people bring that out. So that's partly mindset, and that's partly the environment that we have around us, right? We have to give people the prompts and the triggers to bring that out. So this helps walk the person down the path of meaning and fulfillment simply because it's the feeling we experience. And there's a science behind that feeling, but when we connect, when we have impact, when we understand our contribution, that sense is fulfillment. That's what it creates within us. Okay, so I'll leave you with a final quote here. It's kind of a quote of quotes, and I'll just read it for you. This is Francois Michelin, by the way. This is my wish that the mystery existing in every man and every woman be recognized and acknowledged, and by this refine our outlook on life and our ability to listen, becoming the foundation of all our action. Now, perhaps that says something unique to you. To me, it says there's a miracle inside each and every person here worth paying attention to, and that's what Sarah wanted. Sarah wanted her miracle to be recognized. She wanted it to be discovered. She did not want it to be squandered. And that's our responsibility. I would think the two CEOs that we just talked about, they would say it's our obligation to affirm those around us, and in doing so, to guide those employees whom we are supposed to love toward finding themselves, perhaps even finding their best self, even if it means we lose them in the process. That might just be the best form of giving we can offer, and it's certainly consistent with what we're commanded to do. Now, for you engineers in the audience, if there are any, I could have just put this up 30 minutes ago and you guys would have been all set. So I apologize for that, but here you go, right? So this is the triangle over here, the components of the triangle. I didn't talk a ton about, it goes without saying, the importance of communication once you start to connect those dots internally, externally, vertically, horizontally. there's a rhythm around that communication that needs to be very consistent. Organizations, this is what they get wrong, because when they deal with purpose, they think it's just about the communication, and they focus on that. The environment, I summed it up with one word: trust. And again, I didn't spend a whole lot of time on this idea, but those organizations in the upper right quadrant, they all have one thing in common. They all have very high levels of interpersonal relationship. Leading indicator of that is trust. So if you're going to look at anything, if you're going to examine anything in your organization, look at that component. Can you draw a line of trust from yourself to the shop floor and back, not just to yourself and your immediate colleagues? It's a very important component. And then purpose, if it didn't jump out at you, really has three components for purpose to stick. And to remember that, think about it as head, heart, and hands. We have to know it, of course, right? And this is what I'm talking about, is organizations are really good at pumping the knowledge of their purpose out. We have to know it, but we also have to identify with it personally and individually. We have to internalize it. We have to know how our unique talent contributes toward that end. When we have those three things in place, then purpose sticks. Without those three things in place, you start to see dysfunction, or you see PR machines out there, pumping out, here's our purpose, here's our values. And then if we get those three things right, then the outcome of that is, highly motivated teams, high engagement, high unity. And again, organizations struggle here when they look at, we have low motivation, we have disengagement, we have dysfunctional teams, we have silos, and they start to go after those things tactically and piecemeal. What we really need to do is back up into these two sections and look at how are we connecting the dots, and what environments are we creating, and what prompts are we giving people to bring out that purpose and connect those dots. And then if you want to do any additional learning on this, there's two articles that are worth your while. One is from an organizational perspective. They're both Harvard HBR articles. One is from an organizational perspective, the other is from the individual perspective. I didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about how to unpack your own purpose, but there's tons of stuff out there now about discovering your own personal why, and I think there's plenty of roadmaps out there. But the important point here is that these two things need to be connected, right? It's not just from an organizational structural perspective, it's not just from an individual perspective. We need to connect those two. Today we see a lot of organizations out there helping the individual, and a lot of consultancies out there trying to structure culture. We need to bring those two things together. So I offered those two articles to help bring that together. So that is all I have for today. I hope that you were able to take something out of that. I hope you got some, even if it was a disagreement, that's good, because at least I got you thinking on something then. So thank you for your time, and thanks for the opportunity to come back again.